Good evening and good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Inside Policy Talks. My name is Jonathan Berkshire Miller, Director and Senior Fellow of the Foreign Affairs National Security and Defense Program here at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. And what a pleasure to have my good friend and colleague, Senior Fellow at MLI, Stephen Nagy, here for this talk. So, Stephen, welcome back to the Macdonald-Laurier Institute podcasts.
It's great to be here. Thanks, Jonathan, as always.
And Stephen is one of our senior fellows who's based in the region. He's notionally based in Tokyo, and he has more affiliations than I could possibly read out in the time frame of this podcast. But most notably, of course, he's a full professor at the International Christian University in Japan. And of all the different think tank affiliations, Stephen, we're most proud of the fact that you're a senior fellow here at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. But he has a number of other affiliations as well. Stephen, the focus of today, I mean, you're a prolific writer on many issues relating to geoeconomics and security in the Indo-Pacific. But one of the topics in the frame of today's discussion, actually, I think is a really important part of the region that doesn't get enough attention. And this is the interplays with Southeast Asia. So to sort of open things up and as a little bit of context, Stephen co-edited a very interesting volume on some of the security dynamics and looking at the agency that many of the Southeast Asian actors have when thinking about some of the challenges and opportunities that are popping up in the Indo-Pacific. So sort of to kick things off, Stephen, first of all, welcome back to the show, but can you give us a little bit of a tease on, what made you want to devote some of your time to this book? What are some of the things that you and your co-authors learned? And what might some of the lessons be for Canada as it's sort of evolving in its Indo-Pacific approach?
So thanks, Jonathan. There's three big questions. So my co-editor, Dr. Indu Saxano, and I, as we were putting together this topic, we were wondering, what was the kind of the linchpin or the capstone that brings the Indo-Pacific together? And that was basically Southeast Asia. And we chose Southeast Asia as opposed to ASEAN because we think the heterogeneity of Southeast Asia makes ASEAN not very cohesive. So we had to look at each state and look at how they're viewing the region, how they're trying to balance the challenges of U.S.-China strategic rivalry, and simply try to get a better understanding how this region really is the cohesive that brings a lot of different disparate parts to the region. So that, I think, was an important puzzle that we wanted to bring into this volume. The second area, I guess, the question that you were focusing on is, what are some of the findings? And I think what we found is that the region's heterogeneity means that they have different approaches to the Indo-Pacific region. Vietnam, with its four no's, really looks at the region in a different way. It tries to balance its relationship with China because of the size and its history and its political overlaps. But at the same time, it has serious security challenges. So it uses the Indo-Pacific framing in a way to try and bring in extra regional partners such as Japan and India. Singapore, of course, is small. It needs to balance its interests within the region. Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, again, they have serious challenges in the South China Sea that make it difficult to I guess, balance their interests with China and their long-term relationships with the United States. So my co-author and I really wanted to bring out some nuance, and we brought together Southeast Asian scholars from Indonesia, from the Philippines, from Singapore, from Vietnam to come and write about this. So lastly, and I think importantly, what is the lessons for Canada? Maybe threefold. First, and I want to re-emphasize how heterogeneous the region is, and this heterogeneity makes it a very complex partner to work with. And it's important to choose the partners that you're going to work with in the region. There's a lot of countries, and some countries are stronger and more stable than others. And here, I think Canada needs to work really firmly with Singapore, Vietnam, perhaps Indonesia and the Philippines, as these countries are really the key players within the region. There's other countries like Cambodia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, of course, but these are less pivotal, I think, compared to those other countries. Second is to try and get an understanding of the security dynamics that those countries have with the big players, and that's the US and China. Officially, they all say that they don't want to choose, But when we look at their policies and we look at their shifts, what we see is a tilt towards the United States. And we see that tilt towards the United States because they see the United States as a comprehensive, stable power that brings value to the region. Three, and I think importantly, is the region looks to extra-regional partners for balancing their relationship with China. And here, I think that means there's an opportunity for Canada to invest more in the region, but it should invest smartly. It shouldn't spread the peanut butter too thin, as we might say in Canada. And that means, again, focusing on specific countries where we can build alignment and build synergies and use those synergies for momentum for broader cooperation and engagement in the region.
Thanks a lot, Stephen. I think that's a lot in there, and a lot of great insights. I mean, one of your points that I think I take very well, and I think is a lesson that the Canadian side is still trying to find a way to contort itself as it has its Indo-Pacific strategy, and it's looking to implement this, number one, but also maximize opportunities. Is your point on individual agency, and this is a point that I can consistently make globally, but especially in a region like ASEAN. There's a lot of a tendency, of course, from the Canadian side to look at ASEAN and say, hey, what can we do with ASEAN? What can we do with this part of the world? But I think one of the things I was impressed with your book and some of your insights in this in your last comment was the sense that we have different member states here with individual agencies, histories, interests, and opportunities, and how those interlink with Canada. I think first of all we have to understand that at the ground level. And then, of course, it's not to say that we can't do things regionally and we can't find ways to engage with ASEAN. But I think starting at that core level of looking at those individual relationships and looking at how they look at the United States, for example. And I think you're right. I mean, I often talk about the public forum ASEAN countries and the whiskey bar ASEAN countries. There's very different discussions behind closed doors about how they think about the U.S. relationship, how they think about the Indo-Pacific concept, and probably how they think about Canada. So understanding those differences and those nuances, I think, are important. A quick question, and maybe a little bit of a curveball, but we had a good discussion yesterday with some senior EU colleagues that were here in Ottawa. And, as we get closer and closer to the fall, and I'm sure you're getting more and more questions about, of course, what's happening in November. I'm not going to, be the mean interviewer and ask you what's going to happen in the election. But you're traveling a lot in Southeast Asia. How much of a topic of discussion is the upcoming U.S. election? What do they see as far as the U.S.-China dynamics potentially shifting on this and their interests? How is this playing out in Southeast Asia? And what are some of the things that you're hearing?
Well, there's great trepidation about where the United States is heading and how committed it will be to the region moving forward. And I think there's criticism about the former president, President Trump, and he came to the region and he left the region and he didn't come to some of the key summits. But in the reality, we saw that with the Biden administration as well. So ASEAN and Southeast Asian countries are seen when they look at the United States, they see the United States not serious about building relationships and anchoring themselves in the region. I think there's a realization that under the Biden administration in particular, that Biden has, paid heed to ASEAN centrality, but they've invested significant amount of resources in specific countries. And we only have to look at Vietnam as a good example. And I'm going to come back to the Philippines because I think it's another great example. But for Vietnam, we've had a presidential visit, a vice presidential visit. They've set up a CDC, Center for Disease Control there. They're investing resources. They have regular visits to Cam Ranh Bay, and they're trying to find ways to engage with the Vietnamese through the Vietnam's for no policy. And I think this continues to be the case. We see the Philippines also an important actor. And just last week, Prime Minister Kishida of Japan was in Washington. They announced the so-called Maritime Cooperative Initiative or Activities Initiative, talking about not only maritime security, but talking about emerging technologies, infrastructure, and more security cooperation. So these mini-lateral relationships the United States is engaging provides a lot of stability to the region and confidence. So I think that's actually quite another way to look at how Southeast Asia is looking at a country like the United States is that they see its huge possibilities at a bilateral level, but also a minilateral level. The trick is matching what each individual Southeast Asian country's interests are and how that can resonate with the United States. Singapore, of course, has very strong relations with the United States. Indonesia continued to strengthen its relations with the United States, while at the same time strengthen its relations with China. But importantly, as I said, they're always bringing in an extra regional partners such as Japan and the EU to balance the broader region. So as we think about this region, they're thinking about the upcoming election. I think they've realized that whoever's elected in 2024 is not going to spend a lot of time in the region, but they're definitely going to put some diplomatic resources in the region. The question is how they put it in the region, where they put it, and will it be sustainable? And when it comes to Trump, I think many of the countries in the region don't have confidence. When it comes to President Biden, I think that there's more confidence in his ability to have to use diplomacy and use unilaterals and bilateral relationships to engage in the region, but they're also interested in the continuity question. Will it continue beyond a Biden administration?
I think that's a great point, and actually really reflective of some of the discussions we've been having with some other Asian counterparts and European counterparts. I mean, and fundamentally, I agree. I mean, I think at the end of the day, of course, we all are interested and maybe worried and concerned on some levels, but fundamentally, I think you have to look at the the shared equities and interests that you have, regardless of what the result might be, and just work as hard as you can to control the things that you can control. So that's always been my message here to the Canadian audience. I think it's the message to the European audience, and similar to some of our Asian friends, is that, of course, it's the job of bureaucrats and politicians to prepare for all of these things and for us to pontificate from the outside. But the reality is, I think the interests remain and they endure, and there's different articulations, but controlling as much as you can, I think, is important. I do want to hinge off this because actually, you led me down a very interesting area that I wanted to explore as well. And, Stephen, you've written a lot and we've done some things together on the importance of multilateralism. I saw a piece that you recently wrote in the Japan Times on this as well. So I want to connect this and bring this back to Canada, because one of the things that we were arguing before even Canada was talking about the Indo-Pacific was the idea that Canada needed to hinge off partnerships. And I see no partner that is a more important partner to hinge off in this part of the world than Japan. And so this sort of brings me to number one, how Japan's evolving footprint is in Southeast Asia. And that's, diverse, it's longstanding. Trying to compare that to the Canadian side is apples and oranges. But how can Canada, and in what areas could we look to be working with Japan to sort of pursue some of our interests in this part of the world? Because a little bit of the context on this before giving it over to you is my worry now with the Indo-Pacific strategy is it's become hyper-localized, where we're doing things where we're very comfortable, which is the quote-unquote North Pacific. And it's great. I think there's some great news stories with Japan and South Korea on the economic side and on the security side. But how do we leverage some of those partnerships to be providing more international public goods in Southeast Asia, and also to be doing things that are in the mutual economic benefit of countries in that region and Canada? So that's a question that I have for you, because I think that really is going to be the sort of litmus test of this strategy is, are we able to make this a true regional strategy rather than the show up at G7 and talk to the Japanese and show up at G20 and talk to the South Koreans? How do we sort of square that?
Well, this is just my observation. We've had many trade visits to the region, talking about promoting trade and building a bigger trade footprint within the region. But I think this is missing the lens of engagement of how I think our more experienced partners like Japan or Taiwan or Korea are thinking about the region. Of course, trade is important, but they use a keyword, economic security. And I think that there's the economic security within the region, but also how destabilization of economic security in the region can affect Canada. But there's another role here, is how Canada can bring its resources into the region to enhance the economic security of the countries within the region. So broadly, when we're thinking about economic security, and I think this is really a region-wide, there's concerns about sea lanes of communication, there's concerns about breakdown of supply chains, there's concern about weaponizing supply chains and trade that will affect the economic security of the major partners within the region. And we've seen that with the South Koreans having problems and economic coercion by the Chinese, the Japanese experience, the Taiwanese experience this, the Vietnamese and the Filipinos and the Australians have experienced this, and of course our European friends like Lithuania have also experienced this. So as we're thinking about engaging in the region and thinking about what we can do, this lens of economic security is really important. So where can we work with like-minded countries to add more value on economic security in the region? So is that on the sea lanes of communication? Maybe. Is it on helping selectively diversify supply chains of semiconductors? That's probably another area. Is it about cooperating with political entities like Taiwan and countries in the region on disinformation? Because I think this also affects economic security. Or do we become that steady provider of critical minerals and energy to the region? And again, that adds to economic security. So where are the areas that we can add value, and that adding value to the region provides a more sustainable region-wide role rather than, as you said, this ultra-focused role on, let's say, trade with, a Southeast Asia focus or Northeast Asia focus. I think that we need to carve out our role by thinking about how these countries in this region are thinking about economic security, their priority. And I think we can do more there. And this does mean working with, I think, the leaders on economic security. And one of the leaders, of course, is Japan. I think Taiwan is also doing a lot with their new southbound policy and diversifying. Again, this provides us a little bit more of a framework. But the Southeast Asian countries as well, bringing in those extra regional partners is a way to enhance their economic security and their strategic autonomy so they have more options. So trade and economic security, and thinking about how we can match our comparative advantages to the region's needs is going to be really important for a sustainable role.
Yeah, I think that you're right, and it sort of it leads me back to thinking about so Shangri-La Dialogue, which is coming up at the end of this month, and I'll be attending that, and having been to previous sessions and hearing Canadian ministers of defense and Canadian officials describe their engagement in the region. I think pointing to this niche capability and actually also selling your narrative and selling your story. So why should the audience care about what Canada has to offer? And I think there are compelling reasons why Canada could provide an added value, but I think you do have to compete and sell that story. So the reason I hearken back to Shangri-La on this is I think traditionally we've come in with sort of a listing exercise, and we've sort of wanted to put our lens on a scan of what's happening in the region. And they know what's happening in the region. I mean, they live there. They know the different dynamics. They know the challenges. They know the opportunities. So I think we need to transcend that point of sort of trying to diffuse knowledge and actually start to provide some areas of real concrete partnership. And I think there are a few areas that have been identified in the strategy. I know you spearheaded an event earlier this year on illegal fishing and maritime domain awareness, and you pointed out a number of good ones there on supply chains and economic security. Cyber, I would add into that as well. So I really think front loading on these capabilities in these areas that we're really good at, and maybe talking less on the issues that sort of just rhetorically take space on the paper, I think it is a really important step. And that starts with leadership. That's the area that we to really make this successful in this part of the world. I think we're going to need that sustained leadership going forward. So one last point, Stephen, before I think we're getting close to midnight if we're not already there in Japan. So one last question for you is sort of bringing this in. I believe there was a chapter in your book also on India. What sort of lessons can we have from India's engagement in this region? Obviously, it's a bit of a fractious period in our relationship with India. But I also think that in order to make our strategy work, we need to have India more involved in our strategic approach. Are there ways in the Southeast Asian context that we could be doing something with India? Are there any lessons we could learn about how India is engaging with this part of the world? Interested in your thoughts on that.
Well, not to be pessimistic, but I think for the foreseeable future, working with India in Southeast Asia is probably going to be challenged. There are some real leadership differences between our countries, And I think until there's a leadership change in either country or both countries, we're not going to get a lot of momentum here, to be frank. I think, though, that the areas that we can look at India in terms of its engagement within the region is that it's not so much focused on security cooperation. It's focused on infrastructure connectivity. It's focused on expanding its trade footprint. It's focused on what kind of role India can have to bring some stability into the region. And it goes back to my point about economic security. And we saw this role kind of emerge out of the COVID-19 pandemic, where India provided, it made up for some of the shutdowns and supply chains in China, but also they tried to get India to be involved with uh, uh, um, vaccine manufacturing. So India has a role to try and bring stability and provide public goods within the region, because it's so big and because it's potential to upscale that output. It has the potential to really add value to Southeast Asia's stability, its access to resources, and potentially, more trade. So in that sense, I think that Canada can find ways, and find those avenues to communicate with India to expand its role within the region as a public good provider. And there's a lot of different areas there that I think we can work on. Um, Transnational disease is a good possibility. Maybe education is a possibility. Maybe thinking about how India engages through Singapore to engage in finance and investment through the region may be another way that Canada can actually expand its own footprint within the region. But it's going to take time. It's going to take some changes in leaders, most likely. And I think in the Canadian context, we have to be much more sensitive to how our domestic politics can negatively affect the bilateral relations between India and Canada. And that requires a little bit more savvy from politicians on all sides of the fence. And this is going to be difficult. Canada is a multicultural country with lots of different interests, but I think we can do better there. And that requires, good policy advisors, much more knowledge about countries like India and their sensitivities, and understanding that we can address those sensitivities in private, but we have to be more sensitive in public to ensure that we are building a broader framework for cooperation, whether it's in Southeast Asia or the broader Indo-Pacific, through, I think, those diplomatic sensitivities that are really necessary to build broader, sustainable relationships, and make the difficult stuff, behind closed doors, and that's not something that we've been very good at over the past few years.
Well, that's a good, if somewhat depressing but accurate, good way to close off. And I think you're right. I mean, I think this could be another podcast altogether. But the idea of sacrificing our national interests and foreign policy interests at the altar of domestic political pandering, and this has happened on both sides of the aisle, over the past decade. So it's unfortunate. It's something the Institute cares a lot about. It transcends just the Indo-Pacific. We see this in a range of different diaspora groupings. So I think it's a really interesting and good point. Stephen, you've been very generous with your time, and we're so grateful to have you, number one, here for this podcast, but also there in the region to give us these insights and to be MLI sort of a voice on the street to relay these back to Canadians. So thanks so much for your time, and looking forward to having you back in Ottawa very soon.
Thanks, Jonathan. Look forward to it, and look forward to seeing you soon.